Hello, and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Matt Kenyon, Director of First Impressions here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week, we're dispelling some very common myths often perpetrated by those on the Christian right. Joining me in studio is Kat Grant, our former Equal Justice Works Fellow, who is now a contributing writer for us. Nice to see you, Kat.
Hello, it is great to be back.
As always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discussed today. Please leave your questions in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show. Joining us today is social worker, activist, and educator Jason Van Ness, author of Jesus Over the Rainbow, 10 Anti-LGBTQ plus myths in the Christian right. Nice to meet you, Jason.
Likewise. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a huge fan of your work, unlike other people of faith.
So Jason, you and I connected before several months ago as you were writing the book. And I know we talked about me potentially being quoted in the book and talking about Day of Hope, which was my very first Ask an Atheist over 2 years ago at this point, and one of my very first big projects as a fellow.
Yeah, it was very, just, if I may, predestined, because I was looking for a way to say that the Christian right was harming kids in other ways than just sexual abuse, which I guess we should probably throw a trigger warning out here. There's going to be talks of sex abuse of children in this talk, but I was looking for a way to show that this isn't just about sex abuse. There are other ways that the Christian right is indoctrinating and harming children, and you eloquently articulated that in that interview. I was like, ask and you shall receive.
Awesome.
Which is traumatic. It's terrible to see where it's going, but I mean, yeah, sorry.
No worries. We thought we would run through some of the myths in your book and let you kind of talk a little bit about them. We probably won't get to all of them, but we'd run through some of the more interesting ones. In fact, let's just start with the big daddy of them all. Myth number one, homosexuality is a sin. What do you think?
I mean, so in that chapter, what I was trying to say is that, dispel the myth that the Bible condemns all forms of gay sex, which is not true. Collectively, if you look at all of the so-called clobber verses, the 5 or 6 verses that have been used historically to justify condemning LGBTQ or homosexuality, the best you can say, and this is if you break down the Hebrew from the Hebrew Bible and the Koine Greek from the New Testament, the best you can say with any degree of certainty is that the writer of these verses, we don't know who wrote the verses in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 19, Leviticus 18, 20, and if you also, but Paul, the New Testament, Corinthians, and the book of Romans. If you dissect those verses, the best you can say with any degree of certainty is these writers of those verses seem to condemn penetrative anal sex between men in a very specific cultural milieu. And I would say that's a cultural milieu of financially exploitive, non-consensual sex. People of status raping slaves, essentially. So that begs the question, does that mean all other forms of gay sex are all right? Little oral sex, mutual masturbation, BDSM, kink. What about people on the A spectrum? Is God okay with that? Because they're not engaging in penetrative anal sex. And if you really look, you got to really dissect those. And I say specifically within Leviticus, because that's the verse, that's the granddaddy of them all, because that, and I said, what to me was more interesting through that research, it was kind of a bust. I was like, wow, I was going to devote a year of my life just to find this out. And then, then I look back and I said, what's more important to me is that why do these verses need to be true, so to
Right.
speak, for the Christian right. And if you look at each of them, they all serve a purpose. Sodom and Gomorrah, that's the verse that's used to say that natural disasters are a result of God punishing humanity because of homosexuality. That's why the Westboro Baptist Church goes out and protests veterans' death, because they say they died because, see, God's punishing them because homosexuality is allowed. I quote in that book, that chapter, I don't know if you saw, it's interesting, Tony Perkins, the Family Research Council, he's a huge proponent of that interpretation of that verse, and his house got flooded in 2016. Leviticus obviously is, and I the interesting thing, and I didn't realize that, is it did dawn on me. I have never really paid much attention to the verses, but if you look at both of them, there's Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. One goes a step further.
Yeah.
Because the first one just says, if a man lies with a male is with a female, it's an abomination. With abomination doesn't mean, it just means contrary to culture.
Yeah.
So historically, the debate has been, are they condemning the top or the bottom?
And that has a lot to do, I know, in classical culture with the bottom is considered a passive actor who really doesn't have any culpability, and that's why the bottom was always someone of lower status, someone who was always younger. So it was really about the active party doing the actual act of violent sexual exploitation.
And so, yes, absolutely. And that's definitely, but there's also, was it possibly the top because he's wasting semen? It's the life force, the life-giving force, you defiling the land of Israel by not inserting and ejaculating into a woman. This small tribe of people who could have been wiped out. So, but then whoever was like, okay, we're gonna dispel this myth. We'll just condemn them both, and then they redacted the second verse, Leviticus 22, to say they both shall be put to death. But regardless, that's the death curse. I mean, that's the death penalty. So that's why they say, you'll see that at Pride. To say like, okay, you all are gonna die because this is what the Bible says. So that's those ones. Then 1 Corinthians and the book of Romans, Paul. Don't get me started. It's hard not to read.
I have personal beef with Paul.
It's hard not to read his work and not really assume he was a self-hating gay guy.
Yes.
Like, sorry, I don't know how, if you read his work, his aversion to sex, it's literally the thorn in his side. It's hard not to make that conclusion. But what I found interesting was that in arsenokoitan, the word in that verse, do you not know that the wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God, the adulterers, blah, 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 homosexuals. That word arsenokoitan has historically, I've not found anywhere else in the Bible that has historically been translated as homosexual. That term didn't exist in the ancient world.
Right.
So that has been the only place where you've seen across all of the translations of the Bible, the various forms of the Bible, that has been translated as homosexual. So when the NSRV, the updated edition, the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, got translated, and now it's not even, it says men who have illicit sex, I think is the translation.
Yeah.
Oh my God, white evangelicals were in an uproar. they were like, Robert Gagnon, he's a professor. He was a professor at a seminary close to me here at Pitt Theological Seminary. He was notorious for finding any way to make disparaging comments about queer people in seminary, to such an extent when he left, he even said, I don't think I'll even get a job. That's how outspoken I am. Like, he's now at some Baptist seminary, Houston Baptist Seminary, I think, which is the most hostile.
That sounds right.
Yeah. So he went on the record and said, oh my God, like the translators are showing their bias. The Gospel Coalition also said that this was an egregious mistake, blah, blah, blah. Mind you, the Gospel Coalition is the same publication that allowed a parent basically to go on their blog and brag about not affirming their trans kid who attempted suicide.
Yeah.
So, so there's that. And then Romans, the book of Romans. That's the verse that's been used to justify that it says unnatural and condemn female sexual minorities, because they say like he gave them over to, and women engaged in unnatural sex. But unnatural sex in the ancient world could have been a lot of things. I drew a lot in the work of Dale Martin in that part of the book to say, like, in those temples in the Roman Empire, they had some pretty freaky sex.
Yeah. I know ritual sex was incredibly common. Temple prostitution was an incredibly common practice, and ancient Jews and ancient Christians were very much trying to differentiate themselves from the pagan world that was surrounding them, because that's what really defined themselves as a people group.
But like you said, the top bottom portion, like women could top men a lot, castrated men, penetrated men. So and what I wanted more than anything from that chapter to say is, like, we can't go back. We have nothing subsequently, like especially the book of Leviticus. The Hebrew Bible is silent on homosexual behavior after those verses. And Paul doesn't clarify what he meant at any point, especially with 1 Corinthians. So at the end of the day, we can only assume what they meant in those verses. And we would not allow that now, that type of shaky category, or we shouldn't allow that type of shaky category, those shaky, ambiguous evidence to influence making categorical statements. We wouldn't. So why do we allow that here? Obviously, that's a rhetorical question. But I say to parents, like, are you going to seriously devastate your children on a collection of ancient literature that we can't go back and fact check? And I'm telling you that as a person of faith. Like, seriously, like, get with it now. Sorry.
Yeah, I thought one of the things that you talked about in the book that I thought was really interesting was you talked about how people have this aversion to LGBT community, and they use, well, God said that it's bad as their argument, but yet they chose a church that sees LGBT as bad, yet they could have chosen a church that accepted all LGBT community, which your conclusion was really nice in what you ended. Like, what would the world look like if all these religions said, we now accept the LGBT community? I thought that was really poignant of pointing out there's a choice here.
I just wonder what it would look like. I just wonder what the world would look like. I mean, if that were the case.
Yeah.
And I'm part of a very socially justice leaning church that is radically inclusive. We have a social justice ministry for every possible social justice issue you can think of that is truly about helping people in need, between immigration, racial justice, LGBTQ issues, homelessness, etc. But you know what? And I think I said I wasn't going to write another book because, I mean, this book went through a lot of revisions, redactions, starting my publisher, Sacred Press, awesome press, and my publisher, I talk to him daily. We're talking about my next book, Jonathan Foster. He just really wanted to make sure I was kind of appealing to a lay audience. But my next book, I'm going to geek out a little bit. The name of the book is Desperately Seeking Satan, Why the Christian Right Has to Vilify Queer People to Remain Relevant. I'm going to jump into, honestly, if people just kept their church in the church, I wouldn't have written this book. I wouldn't have written this book. So,
You know, that brings us maybe to myth number 2, which is kind of a play off of the first one, right? Like, all homosexual behavior is sinful. And a lot of the same points you made for the first one, I'm sure, also carry over to this one. And then I'm sure there's also more.
Well, I think we got a little bit, and it's easy to, but I think from the first chapter, the second chapter, I was just saying, like, okay, the Bible appears to condemn, or these verses appears to condemn penetrative anal sex between men in that very specific cultural milieu of probably, I would say, I'm not a scholar, but I would say like 300 to 400 BCE in the Hebrew Bible. Yeah. And then the beginning of the Common Era, maybe up until like 60, 70 CE.
That sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, so I think in that's the cultural milieu I'm talking about. But in the first chapter, I mean, I just basically said this idea that the Bible says homosexuality is a sin or being LGBTQ is a sin. Bibles don't talk, like mic drop. I mean, like people say being LGBTQ, queer, homosexuality is a sin based on how they interpret the Bible. But people have been misinterpreting the Bible for millennia.
For sure.
And I talk in the book, I think the biggest, the most notorious example of that is the blood curse in the Gospel of Matthew.
Yep.
Where basically let his blood be upon ourselves and our children. That verse has been used to justify some of the most heinous genocide throughout history, and most notably the Holocaust. So yeah, and I think what bothers me about that is, well, I don't say it's a sin to be gay. The Bible says it's a sin to be gay. You're putting the blame on the Bible. Like
the Bible can't act.
No, seriously, if they did, we'd put it on the pulpit, give it a microphone, and say, here, you preach. Like if that's what the Bible says. So that's what I think I wanted to be able to get in there, is to say, like, okay, it's how people interpret the Bibles in a variety of ways. And at the end of the day, like, what is truth? I quote the Gospel of John, which, I mean, I doubt that exchange between Jesus and Pilate was historical. I don't think these two people would have had anything to say to each other. But if you read it, they go through this dialogue. It's this philosophical discussion about like what truth is. Like, what is truth? Like truth is subjective. Like we all, so yeah. And I think I close with a part on that where I say, okay, so if you're gonna weaponize Jesus or use the Bible for this, there's some elephants in the room you got to contend with. And that is, and it's true. There's nothing in the Bible where Jesus says anything about homosexuality or even homosexual behavior. Apologists will quote, I forget the verse of Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, for a man shall leave his woman, or his, and they shall be united in one. That context of that verse is about divorce. He's in a debate with the Pharisees about whether divorce is permissible. And as a Christian, that's not a Jesus I would want to follow. He would say that any person should never be able to divorce. It's pretty scary if you ask me. But the real elephant in the room is that could have been any Jewish rabbi of the period who said that. The Gospels were anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. So, and I think, and I mean, this is just my theology or my interpretation of the Bible, but if you look across the Gospels, I think Jesus would be pretty pro LGBTQ. He had an affinity for the social outcast. He was ahead of his time. He was against the temple, the temple elite. So yeah. But at the end of the day, we'll never know. Or maybe he was gay.
Yeah.
And he so we'll never know. So again, it's speculative if you're going to say that Jesus had an opinion otherwise, and we can't. Yeah, Bibles don't talk.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear there's a lot of conjecture and assumptions going on, and one of those assumptions that is being made that I think is, at least as somebody who grew up in the 90s, was part of what I was told as I was coming out, is your myth number 3, that homosexuality is a choice. And that's almost fundamental to all of the anti-LGBT stuff you hear out there.
Yeah, I think, so the point of that chapter, more than anything, I wanted to make is no one knows what causes any kind of sexual orientation, whether it's gay, lesbian, bi, queer, heterosexual, we don't know. And anyone who's claiming to know is lying to you. There's that. And, we have to look at the history, specifically within psychiatry, the history of homosexuality in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Once upon a time, it was a form of mental illness, and especially in the first DSM-1, it was in the same category of diagnoses as pedophilia. So it was you were sick. You had some type of inborn pathology.
There's something wrong with you.
Well, the belief was if you caught it early enough, you could fix it.
Sure.
And if you fixed it soon enough, but if you didn't, it would be chronic, and you were comparable to what we would probably consider antisocial personality disorder, sociopathy, is what we would call it now. So you were dangerous.
Right.
And I've interviewed many people. I write in the book. It just chilled me when I was talking to this guy. He said basically he was experiencing same-sex attractions and was took to his doctor because that's what you did. And that from the doctor, he was affluent, he had money, so he could actually access psychiatry back then, and was going through the whole process. And he woke up to a shotgun at his head, where his dad said, "If you touch your siblings, I'll kill you." And I've heard many stories of that nature. Yeah. Honestly, that still happens now. So, however, as we move towards the 1970s and the field of psychiatry began to utilize more evidence-based interventions, things like psychological testing, personality testing. It was really hard to back the claim that it was mental illness, because they were showing that people who had same-sex attractions, again, I'm going to go on the record here and say, and I'll talk about, most of the research we have on sexual minority people was cis gay men. But the research they had, it was showing they're not differing in terms of intelligence, emotional regulation, propensity to violence. There's nothing there to suggest that these people, should be mental illness. So it was by the time it made it to the board, the APA, the vote to take it out of the DSM. Now, it remained in the DSM for some, I think, 30 years, lingeringly. I think by 2002, I think it was in a Z code as an adjustment disorder before it was taken out entirely. But there was no basis to say it was a form of mental illness. Now, that don't mean the entire APA agreed with that. Dr. Robert Spitzer, who I'll talk about if we get to it, he says, and he's supposedly instrumental in it being taken out of the DSM, although he was he was very transphobic, like many of these sexologists are. He said the APA caved to activist pressure, essentially, because he would go on to publish a study in the early 2000s that drew the wrath of the scientific community. Right. So so at that point, so now we move to the point now, what is completely irrefutable is that people can willfully change their sexual orientation. That's done. There's no evidence that someone can change their sexual orientation. And I talk about her. I talk to her frequently. I probably update her at least once a month, Dr. Lisa Diamond. Send her stuff saying, yeah, your work's being distorted again. Dr. Lisa Diamond, she's a pioneer, because like I said, most of the research we have is on male sexual minorities. But Dr. Lisa Diamond, she's done a lot of work, groundbreaking work on the study of female sexual minorities and bisexual people. And she shows that sexual orientation identity can change over time, how people characterize their attractions. But she says actual physical arousal is only a slice of the pie in terms of human sexuality. A lot of things go into how people identify sexually. Emotional attraction, fetish, kink, all kinds of other aspects go into how a person characterizes their sexual orientation identity. And she shows that some people, she did some pretty good longitudinal work, followed a group of female sexual minorities. And so some of them do change in how they identify, some straight, some bi, some queer. And her work is heavily distorted. Most notable is Dr. Nicolosi of the National Association of Reparative Therapy of Homosexuality. He really distorted. And she went on one of the major and said, dude, stop distorting my work. Like this is wrong. Stop it. You're harming people. So And I actually notified her last month, Preston Sprinkle of the holy the holy sexuality or christiansexuality.com. I said she went on his podcast. I emailed her. I said, "What the f? Like what do you know who you just interviewed with?" And she was like, "Yeah." And I don't blame her. I don't blame her because I think they knew what he was doing whenever he brought her on his podcast, and she fell for it. Um, so, but now, so we know section, and they know that, and that's why if we get to that point, I talk about the whole purity culture 2.0. That's it's not a sin to be gay, just don't act on it.
That is the narrative that really started taking off when I was coming out in the late aughts 2010s. That was the narrative that I was really surrounded by. I think for the sake of time, we are going to skip ahead to actually one of my areas of expertise, myth 7, that trans people are confused.
So if I could just throw one thing in, I think the it's not a sin to be gay thing is worse than getting disowned. Trying to force people not to deprive themselves of their natural sexual urges, I've seen in clinical settings, that is worse. And that's coming from someone who was disowned by my father, and I got over that. But for people who internalize that homophobia and say, okay, I'm just not going to act on it, the reality is they will likely act on it. It's just a matter of how and when. And some of the worst clinical outcomes I've seen have been from people who are in this don't act on it type thing. So, okay. Yes. Myth number 7. Yes. Trans people are confused. And it's just, it is, I heard, we were talking earlier, you're saying this is kind of a big deal. It's a huge deal right now.
Yes. Especially this week with Skrmetti at the Supreme Court.
Insane. I always say I hope none of them ever have a trans kid. I really do. I for that trans kid and for them to realize wow, I was such a monster. I think, and I talk about this, I knew it. I said, and it's interesting because marriage equality, when that whole took off in 2011-ish is when you started to see it with Prop 8, and then that we were going towards the Obergefell when they said that was going to the Supreme Court. I was like, oh, that will never, that's not going to go anywhere. I said even Pennsylvania, where I am, I was surprised that people said I think I said it maybe 2 months before. I said we can't even privatize the sale of our liquor. How is gay marriage or marriage equality ever going to go into effect? And 2 months later, I was like, wow, I'm just eating my words, man. So it was the marriage equality was in effect. It was in full effect when that was going on. So when 2015 hit and the Obergefell decision hit, and it was I was like, wow, this is it for them. This is everything. Who's next? Who are they going to do? I didn't know who it was going to be. I said trans people.
Yeah. That was
trans and non-binary people. This is it. And then within 6 months, I'm a freaking psychic. The bathroom went into now. Bathrooms have always been an issue. The issue because I've worked in schools where we've implemented bathroom policies, changing rooms for trans and non-binary kids, which draw the wrath of school boards. That's always been an issue, but it was too. It was from this to this, it just went and it just kind of snowballed ever since, with the attack on trans people. And I've been doing this for 10 years. And I think once upon a time I had a variety of referrals that I get. It's always trans non-binary kids, the issue I'm dealing with. So, or I'm trying to work with to find a solution for. And then bring it back to the Bible, there's nothing in the Bible. There really wasn't
at all.
No, there was really no concept of if you look in, if you would have to go outside the Bible just to see the understanding, especially in the Greco-Roman Empire or maybe the Persian times. You were a deviant form of a man if you weren't women. There was no concept of gender. There was no binary model of gender the way we have here.
I mean, even women in most of classical antiquity were considered just deformed men or men without souls. This was a very common concept in classical antiquity. And I also just recently, like yesterday, read a thing from the Center for Prophetic Imagination about how our earliest date for Genesis actually is later than our earliest written known reference to someone who exists outside of the gender binary. And you
Yeah.
see references of people who exist within that kind of format that, like everything in the very ancient world, we have very little knowledge or understanding of. But when you think about the way Joseph, in the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors, and the way he was treated actually very much aligns with how we saw gender expansive and gender nonconforming people being treated in the Middle East. And that story can very much be read as a form of a trans narrative, except it's been interpreted out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, I mean, so the one verse I've seen in Deuteronomy, a man should not wear a woman's garment. That's, I've even struggled to see the most fervent anti-trans apologist make a claim to say that's at a ban on cross-dressing at best. But if you dig into the scholarship, it's likely commentary on war attire.
Yeah, it's more about deceptiveness and how I've seen it discussed and how I've interpreted it personally in my research.
So so the idea that trans people are confused, I mean, especially if they were brought up in a religious household, a Christian household, evangelical household, they're confused why the God they believe in would make them have this disconnect between the sex they're assigned at birth and their gender identity. Why they would allow that to happen, that God would allow that to happen. And I think that and I talk about this, I think, I've worked both at the inpatient and the outpatient level of care. And it's usually a crisis of some kind, a mental health crisis in some type of emergency setting or clinical setting or really extreme clinical setting, that a lot of trans people come to realize that that's truly what it is. This under something not being right, this feeling of dysphoria, that's what took them to connect those dots. It's so sad, and they just want to exist. Like, leave them alone. Like, and now, and like I've never, and I've been an ally for the community. Sure, there are a few bad actors on the internet who can kind of make some. I just feel like, wow, you're just giving the right what they need, like in terms of what they do. But trans people are very passive, just benevolent people. And I think what happens is, and this is where we'll see what happens, is that people like Ben Shapiro, or what's the one who's trying to do the ban in the Capitol Hill with the single-sex facilities with the trans?
Nancy Mace.
Nancy Mace, saying your mental illness isn't my problem. They'll say because gender dysphoria is in the DSM, that it's mental illness. And that's why they're confused, because they have mental illness, they think that they can actually change their sex. And
right.
I'm like...
And I think that comes from a very fundamental misunderstanding of how gender dysphoria made its way into the DSM. This is something that I deal with a lot in my own work, where it used to be gender identity disorder, where the incongruence itself was the problem, rather than gender dysphoria as the anxiety and the harm. And I say this as a person who experiences gender dysphoria, the depression as a result of the incongruence. It's the same as depression, anxiety, all of those feelings coming from trauma or something else, where you're treating the depression and anxiety by bringing the congruence together, by bringing your internal feeling to your reality. And I think people don't realize that gender dysphoria is not the same thing as gender identity disorder. I think... Go ahead.
There's a number of people, and I write about this, I mean, and I say I could see an argument for and against it. There's a number of people who think that the introduction of gender identity disorder in the DSM was a backhanded way of trying to repathologize homosexuality.
Yes.
I can see an argument for and against that, and here's why. Like I said, Robert Spitzer, who was supposedly instrumental in pulling the homosexuality out. Although, again, I think he viewed homosexuality as disordered. He even said so in his own words. He would go on to publish a study in 2002 about that people could. He basically called, I think, 100 people who underwent conversion therapies and said, did your sexual orientation change? And they said yes. So he used that as a way to say, he published that study, and it got, oh my God, the scientific community just hammered him.
Yeah.
As they should, because that was a very irresponsible, unethical thing to do. And he just was very transphobic. Like a lot of these people, these sexologists are very transphobic. So, and to the Christian right, they don't separate sex from gender. It's all lumped together in the same way. So I don't think it necessarily is too far-fetched to assume that introducing gender identity disorder, I guess the argument against it would be the idea that they were trying to get it out of the whole fetish element,
Yes.
is what it was before. But I will tell you, I've treated gender dysphoria, and I have never used it as a primary mental health diagnosis. Never. And never. I've always, we are in the United States, our health insurance system sucks. So I think that, and the DSM, like our healthcare system, is deficit-based. It's not strength-based whatsoever. So the National Association of Social Workers, who I'm licensed with, that's the purview I work through, we view it as a medical condition and not a mental health diagnosis. So, and as I said, I've never used gender dysphoria as a primary diagnosis. So I do believe that we got homosexuality out of the DSM. I think we can get gender dysphoria at least maybe to a Z code. I don't know. But you know what I mean? I think that it's possible. Do I see it happening? Probably not.
Not anytime soon, I would guess.
Not anytime soon. Yes, yeah. I think it's going to take some, we'll see, maybe DSM 8 to see. But we need people, and this is where I think there's a lot of transphobia within the field of psychiatry. Why are the APA not coming out and saying this stuff? Saying okay, yes, it's in the DSM, but this doesn't necessarily suggest that serious and persistent mental illness is to be expected for people who have gender dysphoria. So,
Wow, that was a lot. We are going to jump ahead for time considerations to myth number 10. LGBTQ plus rights are an attack on Christianity. Well, duh, of course, right, Jason?
Because rights are pie.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously I didn't really pay attention much to Christianity. I write in the beginning of the book that I had trauma within church. It was very serendipitous thing that I found myself where I am within my church. If my church wasn't in existence or I didn't have another church like it, I wouldn't be there. So I wasn't really paying attention. I think where my attention came in was in the Trump election, 2016, or 2015, leading up to that. And really, you hear some people say that he grew up religious or he went to an evangelical church. I don't think Trump could quote scripture to save his life. He couldn't.
He in fact has proven that by saying, it's just too hard. There are too many great quotes.
Well, he said, "What is your favorite verse?" And he said, "I wouldn't want to get into that."
That's very personal.
Are you an Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy? Probably both. I died. I remember sitting there, I was at a bar, drinking. I remember watching that. I was like, "This isn't real. This is satire."
Much like when he said that his favorite book was 2 Corinthians. I was like, well,
Great
I don't
book.
think you know what that means.
I know. And I mean, but I think, interesting I point out in that chapter is that he doesn't have much, he's got all the traits of a televangelist, rich, corrupt, sexually immoral, financially more like so. But he really drew on that narrative of the Christians being under attack type thing. Like and it definitely was the strategy. If you look at it, it was totally a replication of the Reagan administration of making America great again. That Christianity is under attack. In the Reagan era, that was the Cold War was coming to an end, communist threat, like Christians, families. So it was just the way to, and you often hear people say that it was the Obergefell decision, the marriage equality going into effect that kind of pegged, that's why they pegged Trump as the pick for the candidate in 2016. No. That was 8 years for the Christian right of saddling up for spiritual warfare. Not only did you have a black president in term for two terms, you had Don't Ask, Don't Tell being repealed. Obama declared Pride Month, LGBTQ Pride Month. You had the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd hate crime protection, which I lament the fact that we don't pay attention to the fact that included in that act, Matthew Shepard Act, the James Byrd was a black man who was literally dismembered by white supremacists. But the Matthew Shepard, so that brought in federal considerations for sexual orientation. You had Medicaid being expanded. You had the Obergefell decision going. So they just, and I think one of the biggest thing when I was reading the work of Kristen Dumez, Cobes Dumez, Jesus and John Wayne, when she talks about how, and this is really what helped me put that into understand the Christian persecution myth, was the Kamal Salim, the Muslim terrorist, supposed terrorist, who, he took the evangelical speaking circuit by storm because he was supposedly a Muslim terrorist post 9/11. He converted to Christianity and was sharing his story, and evangelicals ate it up.
Yep.
And he was a fraud. He was a complete fraud. And they found out he was being backed by Focus on the Family, knowing he was a fraud. So why would they do that? Because they love this idea of being attacked and like the lengths they go to. And we see this recently with the web designer from Colorado, supposedly contacted by some gay guy who wanted her to design his wedding. And she was like, she said freedom, like her religious.
She made it a speech claim. She said it was a free speech. She disguised her religious objection as a speech claim, which is a trend we're starting to see. It's also a trend with conversion therapy right now. Yeah. Where they're trying to contextualize talk therapy as speech and therefore cannot be regulated.
But, I mean, yeah, and like it turns out it wasn't a gay guy. It was some straight guy.
Yeah.
They contacted him. The journalist who was looking into it was like...
Well, it turns out the name on it, it was all fake. The guy that so-called contacted them had no idea about any of this.
He's like, I'm straight, I'm married, like, I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. But it still went to the Supreme Court, and they sided with her, I guess, on the understanding that she might get contacted someday, be asked to do it.
Standing jurisprudence got completely thrown out the window.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, so that was then, 2016, like into 2020, like, so where are we going to be 4 years from now with this idea of Christian persecution, and what lengths are people going to go to? And I think where you're seeing it, and I worry about it as a social worker, is this whole school voucher system.
Yes.
So, and I think, considering from that, and I didn't want to get too deep into this in this chapter of the book, is the idea, and where I'm going to look, where I think you're going to see it is that, I think from 2020, after the 2020 election, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was like 16 to 20% of, and this was Pew Research, 16 to 20% of Trump supporters who did not identify as evangelical adopted that identity after. So we're seeing, and I quote the research in the book, like, so you're seeing the term evangelical become just void of any theological significance. It's an ethnopolitical identity.
It's become a very political term, at least in the United States.
So I just think that, and prior to this election and the survey data leading up to it, 2021 to 2023, there was already cause for concern in terms of the survey data showing white Christians who believe that political violence is justified, is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So where are we going to be 4 years from now? And that's why I'm like, okay, I was going to write a book about the history of drag and just as like another book, but I contacted my publisher. I said, we're going to scrap that because I want to watch it happen in real time.
Yeah.
I'm going to watch it happen in real time. And I think that what you're going to see is, I think trans people definitely will be the scapegoat for some time. But I just think you're going to see more hate crimes in the name of religious freedom type stuff. That is what I think we're going to see. And that scares me. And hear me, I have a bullseye on my back because I just wrote a book about it. I have a blog. I post all the time. So I'm a perfect target for this stuff.
Hey, we've probably got a bullseye painted on the top of our building over here.
And I mean, but I also remind myself that I'm, in a lot of ways, I'm a white male.
Mm-hmm.
So at least, Black, any of those intersecting identities are going to be the ones I fear for, obviously more than myself. But I would be and I'm preaching to the choir here. So I just wonder what this is going to look like in terms of this whole Christian persecution myth, and how is it going to manifest in the name of, I guess, white Christian nationalism. And that's what we don't talk about enough. We don't talk about that. We don't put that white on it, because Christian nationalism is, and again, you've had Sam Perry, Andrew Whitehead on this podcast before.
Mm-hmm.
That shows, they say, oh, you shouldn't. I don't know if I necessarily agree with him to say you shouldn't call people Christian nationalists, because he says that, so many people fall on the spectrum of, if you surveyed the entire country, some 30 to 40% of people would fall somewhere on that spectrum. I guess I'm not complaining about having Christmas off as a federal holiday. But I don't identify as, I don't think that means you call me a Christian to say that I endorse Christian nationalism. But there are enough of them I think we should personally call it out. But I think, again, that white part is what I think is going to manifest. And I think that inherent in white Christian nationalism, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric is a part of that. And I just don't know where that's going to stop.
Absolutely. And before we move into audience questions, I will recommend to our viewers here on the white Christian nationalism topic to pick up Dr. Anthea Butler's book, White Christian Nationalism is an excellent book on this topic. So highly, highly recommend.
Nice.
And that absolutely. And that's, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel and talk about racism within. But yeah, her work is great. And I love that if I'm not mistaken, she basically says they've had a colorblind mentality because it suits their theological agenda. So, yeah.
So moving on to a question here, I guess we only really have time for one. So I'm going to ask the one that I think is, we've spent all this time talking about these myths and talking about the harm that it's causing to the LGBTQ community. So I guess my question for you, Jason, is, so what do we do? How do we combat these myths? How do we move forward in a positive way where we can affect some positive change in this tumultuous culture we're in?
I have two answers. Part of me wants to be like, I don't know, because we've got to see how bad it's going to be. But I think the biggest thing is, just calling out misinformation. That's the thing right there. And I talk about that when I close out the book in chapter 7 on the anti-trans agenda. It is a textbook example of right-wing authoritarianism. I don't like to make the Hitler reference just because I've seen people get carried away with that.
But I do think it's there with
this.
this.
You can't help but see the parallels. You just can't. In this anti-trans agenda, by the Christian right. So what we need is, I think what we need to do, and this is what I do as a person of faith in trying to negotiate with the religious landscape, is trying to get these people who have different viewpoints, especially conservative viewpoints on gender specifically, to say, look, you don't think trans women are real women, or trans people should play sports, or kids should get gender affirming healthcare, fine. I mean, those are different than my position, but we need you to take a stance to say misinformation will not solve this problem. Enough. That's what I think is the first thing we need to do. We need to have a way. I would say, don't get into pissing contests on the internet with people. I try not to. Sometimes I can't help myself but jump, because I moderate like 10 groups and I get people who come for me all the time. Again, try to get to that point where we can say, what is your evidence? Show it to me. Let's talk about that. To say that you don't have any evidence there. And I want to point there too, the other thing too, and I'm going to go back to this, is that the whole anti-trans agenda, the whole anti-trans stuff is nothing. It's about deeply dogmatic. God made you a male with testosterone. God made you a woman to be a baby machine, to bring in the future warriors of Christ, to fight this attack on Christianity. It has nothing to do with trans people. And again, if that's your position, say that. Just say that.
Yeah.
If that's what it is, just say that. Stop putting out this bunk.
Stop being disingenuous.
Yeah.
Well, it's just not fair.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with, and that's what I think so when I say right-wing authoritarianism, you've got to be able to understand what that means. Because again, I think when people hear authoritarian, they automatically think of the Hitler, they think of those extreme things. But what defines authoritarianism, from my perspective, is where not truth, because again, as I've said, I think truth can be subjective. Facts are subjugated to power.
The more power you have, the more right your
facts don't matter, because they're subjugated. So here's facts, so you can present them here, but that doesn't matter, because all that matters is power. So we really need to look to say, like, how much is, again, calling out misinformation first and foremost, and really understanding how authoritarianism is manifesting in U.S. politics. I think to really be able to describe it and say, get an understanding, okay, this is really happening.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jason, for coming onto our show this week. Can you tell our viewers where they can find your book and follow your work?
So the book is on Amazon, Jesus Over the Rainbow, 10 Anti-LGBTQ Myths in the Christian Right. It's on my website, jasonvanness.com. All my socials are plugged to my name. I hope to be back sometime again on FFRF. I'm looking to start something here in Pennsylvania once I get some free time. This whole post-COVID world.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, thank you. And I will be working on my book. I'm giving it 3 years because I want to capture data in real time as it's happening to see how anti-LGBTQ rhetoric is going to manifest within the Christian right moving forward. I'm going off social media all of January, gotta say though.
It's probably smart. Probably smart.
Yeah. Well, that wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. A new episode of our broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters, airs this weekend. FFRF co-presidents Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker will speak with Mickey Dollins, an Oklahoma state representative who has been fighting for church-state separation.
In many regards, Oklahoma is a test case for different states such as Louisiana, Florida, Texas. They all kind of work in conjunction with each other. If you see something passed in Louisiana, such as the mandate for the 10 Commandments in every classroom, you can be sure that you'll see the same thing in Oklahoma. There's a network of people behind the scenes that are pushing a Christian nationalist agenda, and they recruit politicians to do their bidding. I warn against this stuff because it's anti-constitutional. I took an oath of office to uphold our Constitution. I'm not anti-religion at all. I'm just pro-Constitution.
You'll be able to watch that episode on TV stations around the country this weekend and soon on the FFRF YouTube channel.
And don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. This week, you'll hear from New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg about the threat of Christian nationalism. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast exclusively hosted by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us. See you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.